Открытия в нейробиологии и биоинженерии используются в разных сферах. Они внедряются...
Innovation in biology are used in different spheres, and together with the development of the artificial intellect, they help to cure the brain. And the Brain and Behavior Laboratory director Aldo will tell us how to use these diagnostics. And I'm giving the floor to moderator Yerlan RAMANKULOV.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to greet you in this studio and present today's next speaker. With great enthusiasm, let me introduce Aldo FAISAL, a professor of artificial intelligence and neuroscience at Imperial College London. Dr. Faisal's expertise lies in combining data-driven methods, machine learning, and human behavior and neuroscience to develop novel human-aware AI technologies that helps people in health and disease. He's founding director of the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in Artificial Intelligence for Healthcare at Imperial College London. His own research labs are the Behavior Analytics Lab at the Data Science Institute and the Brain and Behavior Lab at Department of Bioengineering and Department of Computing. He's associate editor for Nature Scientific Data and PLOS Computational Neuroscience. He acted as a program chair in key conferences such as KDD, Neurotechnics, NIPS, IEEE, Body Sensor Networks. He was elected in 2016 to the Global Future Council of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Named Associate Group Head at MRC London Institute of Medical Sciences and made Honorary Senior Fellow of Oxford University's Nuffield Department of Clinical Neuroscience. With this, without further ado, let me yield the floor to Dr. Aldo FAISAL.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to all these young minds. And I hope we can have, in the second part of my talk, a great discussion. I'm sorry I cannot be with you physically. I'm still in London due to the global situation that we're currently all living with, but I hope to be able to visit you soon. Without further ado, I want to launch into my talk and hope that that technological step is easier than doing AI and neuroscience. I hope you can see my slides now. So as I was introduced, I'm an AI researcher and I'm a neuroscience researcher. I hold degrees in both fields and I'm trying to work at that interface. And what I want to talk to you about today is how we can move towards a human AI symbiosis, where AI needs to meet neuroscience to build systems that help us humans be better humans. It's very important. So when we're talking about AI or artificial intelligence, we're really talking about the search for an answer to the question, how do we build systems that deliver solutions for which humans need intelligence and skills? And if you look at the 70-year history of artificial intelligence, much of the early 30 years were built with basically engineers crafting, so to speak, expert systems that tried to build technology like a human invention, like building a car, like building a train. And that approach actually failed. And very quickly, then people in the 80s then realized that maybe we need to think differently about intelligence. We need to think about the approach coming from neuroscience. And here the core idea was that we want to not build systems that can solve problems. We want that these systems learn alone how to solve problems. And so that's a key challenge that was taken up, and there was taken a lot of inspiration from neuroscience. And this led then to the invention of neural networks, and then by the 2010s to the invention of deep neural networks or deep learning, which is a brain-inspired approach to build systems that can learn from data. I don't want to talk about the specifics of the AI systems, and I don't want to talk about deep learning specifically today. I want to talk to you about AI operating at a different level at the interface with neuroscience. So one thing that I think is very interesting about AI, unlike most other technologies, is that effectively we're answering the question how to build an AI system by the idea, well, we have to train it, teach it like a child, and it needs to learn from data. And this approach has produced a surprising amount of manifestations of AI that are tangible in our everyday life. Be it about, you can have a conversation with your phone and instruct it to do things, or you hear about self-driving cars and their accidents they have on the road, but they're actually cars on the road that do that. And I call that the AI iceberg because you can only see a small amount of these solutions that are very tangible, but actually the vast amount of AI that's deployed in the world is actually under the hood. You don't notice it. In fact, you don't notice it till I switch off the AI functionality. And then suddenly you notice that things were not as convenient as before. So what does this have to do with neuroscience? Well, on the neuroscience side, people have been trying to understand how does the brain work. And the challenge for that is that the classic approach is, well, let's work out how the brain works by recording from neurons, the cells of the brains. And what I'm showing you here is a beautiful result from a colleague of mine, where they simply tried to look at publications over the past 50, 60 years in trying to measure how many neurons can we measure at the same time from the brain. And what you can see here, this is the year when the study was done, and this is the number of neurons that you can measure. And basically every unit here means that you can increase tenfold the number of neurons record from. And the beauty is, there seems to be an exponential law. So this goes up, and in the 60s you could record from 1 or 2 neurons, and nowadays you can record from hundreds or thousands of neurons at the same time. And that was possible through many technological leaps and bounds that advanced the technology. And so this is very similar to Moore's law in the development of computer chips that also said that roughly every so and so many years, the ability to shrink computer chips or increase their power basically doubles. And the same we see in neuroscience. The problem is that if you actually want to be able to understand the whole brain, you need to record from this many neurons, namely 100 billion neurons. And even if the technological progress keeps going at the current breakneck speed, it will still take to 2010 for us to be able to record from all the neurons. And this poses a challenge to thinking about how neuroscience can help us in daily life solve real-world problems and help questions around AI. We simply cannot record from sufficient number of neurons, and even if we were to able to record from all the neurons, how do we make sense of it, of how the brain operates? And so here, I'm now switching back to AI to basically highlight a fundamental challenge that we're seeing, that in AI, effectively, things are driven by machine learning approaches. And for these learning approaches to operate, we need a lot of data. And that's why we're talking about big data very often, because these machines require a lot of information. When we're talking about AI, we also need to talk about how we can use AI. And effectively, most of my lab's applications are based on augmenting humans with AI. It's about making it easier for humans to operate and live. And this is a beautiful slide from a study that was recently done, where they're trying to explain how AI can help, especially in the domain of healthcare, which is one of my chosen application domains. And effectively, the realization is that the amount of healthcare supply of people, clinicians who are working in the healthcare sector is not growing fast enough compared to the clinical demand that people are facing. And this means there is unmet demand. And the idea here is to use AI to reduce the unmet demand, to basically help doctors and nurses to reduce their burden so that they can focus on the complicated cases while AI systems help them to speed up the simple cases. And this is how we should think about AI and AI-human symbiosis. How can we build and develop AI systems that don't replace humans, but augment them, allow them to deal with these vast pressures our modern societies are facing? And so here, a very important concept comes now in from neuroscience, namely that if you look at how the brain operates, you see that it often operates in a loop. So for example, to perceive this ball, your eyes need to process the signals coming into them. Then neurons and networks need to process the information. This needs to be learned in some way at synapses. And then at the end of this process, an action needs to be formulated that goes from the brain into the spinal cord to your muscles, and then, for example, raises the hand so you can catch that ball. This loop is a loop. It's constantly operation. However, the way it's often studied in neuroscience is that we cut open this loop, that we basically just provide a stimulus and measure the response, and provide a stimulus and measure the response. However, most of life happens in closed loop. There's always direct interaction. And this leads me to briefly talk about how we can think about the brain and why AI and neuroscience are actually very close to each other. So my colleague David Marr formulated a beautiful view of how we can think about what levels of organization a brain needs. And he said that there are basically 3 levels of organization. At that top level, it's called the computational level, is the question about what solution strategy should my brain pursue to solve a task? How should I do it? Once you've fixed your solution strategy, then basically you need to think about what calculations does the brain need to perform, and how should I represent these elements? And that's what we call the algorithmic level. And then at the bottom level, once I've chosen, so to speak, how to calculate and represent my computations, I need to think about how to implement them on a specific system. And this is the beauty of this view, because only on the 3rd level, effectively, it actually matters whether you have an artificial system with computer chips or a human system or biological systems with cells and neurons. So as long as you operate at the top 2 level, it actually doesn't matter whether you're thinking about how does a brain solve a problem or how should an AI solve a problem. And so in our lab and in our research, we focused a lot at this intermediate level. What algorithms should we use to achieve human-like performance? And what representations should we draw an inspiration from human systems? And vice versa, how can we help humans where these type of calculations representations are disrupted by disease or by accident? So what we're seeing a lot in the moment is that in the domain of AI, we're seeing a lot of what I call perceptual AI. So this is settings where some form of technology and equipment and environment or business gives you data from sensors, from situational reports, and then you have a decision maker or an operator like your driver that then makes a single decision and action. And there are many good examples of that. For example, a doctor looking at a radiological scan of a patient and then needs to determine whether that patient has cancer or not. Another example of a perceptual AI is where you speak into your phone and that phone needs to recognize the words that you're saying. And all of these have examples of basically you know what the answer should be, and you can basically formulate a single decision of providing information. And there are many beautiful ways of doing it. So a beautiful example here is from colleagues in Tübingen who have developed an AI system where you're basically taking a photograph of a famous scene and look at how a painter looked at that same scene. And then an AI tries to learn, how does the painter see this world? And then once you have an AI that has learned to see the world like this painter, you can then basically provide the system with a new picture, say here the Houses of Parliament in London, and the system would predict how would a painter see that. And you can do that for Monet, or you can do that for Van Gogh, and basically compute, so to speak, the visual perception of a painter. And it also tells you a lot about, of course, the art of Impressionism that seems to be very heavily based on the actual visual impression that such a perceptual AI system could do that. More importantly, in healthcare, which is probably at the moment the leading front, the leading edge of AI applications in the real world, we can see that perceptual AI systems are very often, I'm giving you a long list of different domains, are outperforming the performance of human experts. We're seeing, for example, in the domain of radiology, and even in the domain of lung disease, for example, that AI systems that are exposed to the same data as human clinicians are, for example, from their eyes or from their hearing, that they can perform at above human levels of performance. And that's wonderful. The challenge, however, arises once you start thinking that actually using perception to diagnose something is only the first step in any decision-making progress. After that, you need to think about intervening on a patient. You need to start treating them. You need to do surgery. You need to manage. You need to choose how to dose what drugs, how to adjust these drugs. And here we're really starting to talk about cognition and AI, not anymore about perceptual AI, because we're really talking here about human skills, where basically you have now the operator or the human decision making an action that has direct consequences on the system. And so the system responds to that interaction, and the human operator needs to then reconsider what to do. And there's basically now a loop operating. So think about the perception action loop I showed you before. So this means now you don't have a single decision to do, you have to do sequential decision making with many different answers. And there are many real world examples. So you can think about here, a ship captain requires to manage how to run this ship so that the ship is being steered. A surgeon needs to devise a strategy of how to cut and operate a patient and then adjust to the situation as it happens. And of course, also in customer relations, an ideal, I'm giving you a British butler as an example, an ideal assistant would understand what the user wants and what the user wants to do next, maybe even before the user actually thinks or expresses this wish. So this is about all settings where we need, so to speak, human level skills. And I want to give you a few examples of how we've tried to tackle this challenge. So we thought that maybe we can advance self-driving car research by learning from the best possible drivers. And in this video that you're seeing here, you see experiments that we did with the world champion in Formula E, Luca Di Grassi, who basically was on a racetrack with us. And we used a fully digital setup to capture everything that he was seeing and everything that he was doing. And we then tried to use these data that we collected to try to understand how to build a better system. So effectively, you're seeing, what the human driver sees, and then you're seeing what commands this human driver is executing. We then built this into an AI system where the idea was that say you have an AI system here in a simulated environment, you're seeing that the human driver is, of course, paying attention to specific regions of where they're driving. And what we thought is that we use this human driver information to basically teach the automated system to look at the road like a human would do. So you're looking at the road, and now we have a model that models the skill of the human who knows what to pay attention to. And this model is then used as an input into the AI system. So just to show you how stark this model is, I'm showing you here basically what the AI system predicts where the human would look. So everything that the human looks at is visible, and everything that the human does not look at is black. So this is actually very little input if you think about that, but that's effectively what your brain sees when you're driving. You're only paying attention to a small region of space. And if we're now taking this information, so this mask information, and give this to an AI driving algorithm, what we discovered is that our algorithm that basically pays only attention to what a human driver pays attention to performs much better, makes much fewer mistakes than a standard AI system that pays to the whole image attention when driving. And not only does it achieve a better performance, it also learns much faster than a system that is not augmented by knowledge of what humans are paying attention to. And so this idea of human visual attention is actually very interesting. So I'm showing you here a painting by Ilya Repin, and it's called The Unexpected Visitors. And if you're now looking at these paintings, your eyes will move over this painting. And these are the eye movements that you can record with the so-called eye tracker. Now, the interesting thing is, your eye movements depend entirely on the task that you're cognitively thinking about. So if I ask you, how old are the people, you are going to look at the faces. If I ask you what was going on before their arrival, then you are going to look at this dynamic scene here of the children and the lady playing the piano. If I'm asking you how wealthy is the family, you're going to look at the quality of the paintings and the quality of the finishes of the wall. And we've been knowing this for 50 years now. That's a typical stimulus response neuroscience study. You know, you show them a picture and you give them a task and then you measure what they do. The beauty is that now we can use artificial intelligence to invert this problem. So if I know how you're looking at this painting, can I judge what you as a human were thinking? And that's the first step in trying to build human AI symbiotic systems. And I'm showing you now an example of that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what people are looking at. And so this is another AI system that basically has a camera built into glasses. And as people are walking around, this system tells us dynamically what they're looking at and where it is in the visual scene. And once we understand that, we can start asking, okay, based on what they're looking, can we work out what they want to do? And so we have a number of examples here. For example, here we build a self-driving wheelchair where the human user does not have any control, it's hands-free. And the only task that they have is to imagine that they're just going along as if they were walking. And the system looks at what they are looking at and based on that tries to work out, are they just looking at things that are relevant for navigation of the wheelchair, or are they just looking at a friend and so forth? And the system is fully operational and very easy to realize. And this black bar that you see in front of my PhD student there, that's an eye tracker. And we can take that to the next level. So here you see a paralyzed patient who has ALS or motor neuron disease. You may have heard about the ice bucket challenge. So these are people who cannot move. And this is a system where this fully paralyzed man is strapped into a robotic harness that is attached to his wrist, and he's wearing a robotic glove that controls the movements of his finger. And this patient just basically looks at the scene and, for example, wants to eat. And so he wants to put this orange into a bowl. And the system automatically understands that he wants to grasp the bowl, goes there and makes his hand move so he can grasp them, and then sees that the person wants to put them into the bowl and then executes that. So that's an AI system that is 100% assistive. It doesn't do anything on its own. The only thing it cares about is to speak and to understand what are the high-level intentions of the human and then execute them through the human body. And that's very important for patients who are paralyzed because they want to retain a sense of agency, but effectively our system operates like the perfect butler. It works out what the human wants to do the moment the person is looking at things and tries to then understand things. Okay, so these are all examples that I've given you that are highly driven by the use of technologies that are sort of based on visual perception, for example. There's no brain interfacing here. All that the user needs is an eye tracker, something that measures eye movement that sits on the eyes. But this idea that we can operate in a loop and use data where we have information about something and then the action of the human about what they then wanted to do, we can also take into a very different setting, and we can take that into the setting of medicine. And so here I'm going to talk now about technology that we call the AI clinician. So this is a project that we've been pursuing for the past 5 years. And the idea is the following. We want to build a system that delivers artificial intelligence-based medical interventions. So imagine you have a patient and now you need to make a decision about how to treat that patient. So for example, you need to give him a drug or IV fluids or something like that. And so basically, a system should monitor the patient and then formulate a decision of what treatment to do. So think self-driving cars or an AI that plays chess, but now the chess game is not a game of chess, it's a game of medical treatments to save a patient's life. And so what we want is that a system observes the patient, starts delivering a drug, observe whether that drug has the right effect, and then keep going with it or change the treatment dynamically. But because we don't want to do this interactively, we don't want to do human experiments, what we've instead developed is an AI that learns this from historical operational data, effectively from any data that's generated in a hospital, where you collect data about patients, and then you know what treatments are given, and then you see what the consequences of this treatment are, and you're building a system that learns based on that. And so we called this system the AI clinician. We published this in Nature Medicine 2 years ago as a proof of principle idea, and we are now taking this system into the hospital clinic. So just to give you a sense of what the system needs to do, I'm massively simplifying the idea. The idea is that a patient comes in hospital, is critically ill, let's assume. And what we want to do is we need to get the patient so that they're discharged and survive and avoid death. And so the AI system needs to basically work out how to get them from admission to survival. And if I'm drawing the map like this, it's very obvious. You can see that the patient can be in different states. And then, like in a board game, you need to find a strategy that, say, when you're here, you go up, up, right, 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 or you can go right, right, up, up, right. And then you will, in both cases, find a satisfactory solution. And so I can basically formulate what you should be doing, go right, go up in each state. That's trivial for us humans because we can look at it thus and it's obvious. Now, the problem is, and the challenge is that medical doctors, especially in complex diseases, cannot exactly tell you what state specifically the patient is at. What's the exact definition of the state of patient is not clear. And it's also unclear often what treatments, so in what directions you act, so what combinations of drugs and other interventions will lead you from one field to another. And so here we developed an AI system that basically processed data from over 20,000 patients, and then basically learned first what the individual states of the system are, and then try to predict based on that what actions you can do. And I'm showing you here just a quick visualization where you're basically seeing each circle represents a patient state. And so the patient can be in hundreds of potential states. And the color of the circle corresponds to how likely they are to survive or die, respectively. So this is the mortality plot. So blue means death, red means survival. And the idea is that you're basically, that patients, for example, this green patient here enters the hospital and moves between these states, either because his disease progresses or because these patients are treated and the treatments move them. And the idea is that you steer the patient away from death into a trajectory that gets them into a health state. And so we can learn from historical data, what did doctors do for patients who were in the same state? What was the best course of action there? And very often you then find that there are, of course, dead ends. For example, in a setting such as this one, for example, you don't want to go up because there's a block here, say the patient had a heart attack, so you cannot traverse these states. So you need to find a different pathway and change how you treat. And so this AI clinician system, we have applied that to the domain of sepsis, which is a major killer. It's the #1 killer in hospitals worldwide. There are 5 million people dying every year. And in the context of the pandemic, basically every patient who dies in hospital from COVID dies with sepsis, just to show you the impact. And this technology that we've developed and that we're now trialing in 4 different hospitals in central London, basically has the appeal that it can recommend doctors what actions to take on a minute-by-minute basis to save a patient's life. We have applied this care units where we have very dense monitoring of the data that comes from the patients. They're strapped into all sort of digital sensors. And at the same time, we can then record what actions, what prescriptions the doctors have made. And just to show you here in a simple graphic, I'm basically showing you what happens if the human doctor gives more or less of a certain drug to a patient. And we are plotting here the mortality of the patient. And so what you're seeing here, that whenever the human and the AI system agreed in their decisions, that the mortality of the patients was lowest. And we estimate that the system will, and it has to be confirmed by clinical trial, reduce mortality by 8% or several thousands lives a year in the UK alone. And just to show you how an AI system that operates as a recommender system looks like, that sits in the hospital, there's no robot, there's no self-driving car or anything. It's basically a software interface. It's very simple in that respect, that shows the clinician the interactions and the clinical data of the patients, and then basically tells them what it thinks the clinician should do. The clinician can then say, well, maybe I want to do something else. And then the system will predict what would happen if another action is executed. And then the doctor can basically observe these recommendations and basically try to engage in a process where the AI system and the human doctor start to building mutual trust by understanding what they are wanting to do and what consequences of their actions are. And so this is what we call a learning to trust technology, because there's a second AI that basically monitors if the recommendations of the AI system are followed and then tries to optimize these treatment decisions. And the beauty of this technology is it's not limited to intensive care or sepsis. The way we formulated our algorithms, they can be operated and applied to any medical condition where we have historical data about the evolution of patients and their trajectory from physiological measurements, heart pressure, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and so forth, and what interventions, so what drugs or what treatments were given to patients in a similar digitized form. And so if we know basically the perception of the doctor and the action of the doctor, and if that is captured, then we can now, with these new technologies we've developed, these new algorithms, we can basically build a model of the cognitive decision-making process in a clinical doctor. And just to give you a sense, so we trained and tested this system on 20,000 patients, and then we validated that on an independent data set with another 20,000 patients that were taken from a different study from a different hospital. And just to give you a sense of how much the human knows versus how much the AI system knows, an experienced doctor in intensive care, when they retire at the end of their career, will have seen on the order of 4,000 to 6,000 patients in their lifetime and treated them. And this AI has already, in the basic form it has, seen more than 5 full human lifetimes of doctors' experience data. So it really can start looking at and combining very different decision-making strategies implemented by doctors around the world and basically work out for this specific patient in this specific state, what would be the best combination. So it's also a way of democratizing access and basically getting the decision-making processes that sits in different doctors and all over the world and try to extract the best possible decision strategy across all of them in pooling human knowledge. And so with this way of basically thinking about how we can study and capture cognitive and decision-making process in human in a data-driven way based on their behavior, on their eye movement behavior, on their physical interaction behavior, or in this case, on how they're actually making decisions at an abstract level, so formulating what drugs to take and observing how the patient is doing, we can build effectively cognitive models of decision-making and experts in the human world. And so we can go now from a neuroscience question to think about how can we measure and augment human skills to a question, how can we augment humans to be the best they can be in health and disease settings. And with that, I really want to come to an end. And of course, this research is never done by one person alone. I have a wonderful lab of postdocs and PhD students, some computer scientists, some engineers, some medical people that are fantastic in joining us in this exciting endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aldo. That was a great presentation. So let's see if we have any questions. Does anybody have any questions? Please.
Dear Dr. Faisal, when do you think we will have AI-powered doctors?
I think it depends what we mean by AI-powered doctors. So we are already seeing in a lot of settings in radiology, so whenever we have image data of scans from the heart or the brain, for example, already AI systems in operation in a number of hospitals, and these are often performing above human performance levels. So that has started in this perceptual AI domain. I think in this domain of sepsis, we're piloting this technology in 4 hospitals. We will hopefully know in 1.5 to 2 years whether we can scale it up to a whole UK national level. There's a clear will to try to apply these technologies because they can reduce the burden on patients. This is, of course, always limited by us having the right type of data. So I'm not sure it will be easy, for example, to build AI systems for general practitioners or surgeons, because there's basically limits to what data we can capture. But in a lot of specialties that are very data intensive and data rich, I think we will see AI doctors or AI systems that support human doctors growing really rapidly and being in daily use in the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions?
Mental health is very important. So how can we as a society become more inclusive for people with these like motor disorders?
That's a wonderful question. So one of the most interesting things to remember that most people forget is that virtually all modern human interaction technology has been born out of the need to help people with disabilities. So the typewriter was invented and the keyboard was invented for people who had a motor disorder in the hand. The telephone was invented because or motivated by helping people who cannot hear very well and they needed a hearing aid. And we can go through a whole range of technologies. The first system that could process computer-based speech was invented not for a secretary or for a dictation purpose. It was to help deaf people understand what was spoken. And so we believe that this usability of assistive technology to become effectively consumer technology will drive a lot the inclusivity. And I think what's important is that we always think about how to help in our technological design, not just about some customer at the end, but how to actually help a concrete patient with concrete disabilities. Very often, if you build a solution for them, it's also very useful for all the consumers out there.
Thank you. Please, more questions? Okay, if our audience doesn't have more questions, let me ask you a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind. So last year, I was thoroughly impressed by the success of the artificial intelligence system, which was developed by DeepMind. The problem of the protein folding, which was absolutely unsolvable for since 80s, when the computing power became widely accessible to research community, we could not do anything about it, really. And DeepMind solved that in several hours. This is probably one of the brightest and most mind-boggling results of what AI can do, at least in my mind. And so do you expect such an explosion of possibilities and such a breakthrough in distant medical treatments, or in what you do, augmentation of the capacitated people, etc.?
So that's a very good point. So the interesting thing about that AlphaFold, I think the technology is called, is that it actually, the AI per se is clever, but what actually enabled it was the vast availability of data. And here, of course, in the bio and biotechnology sciences, there has been a long tradition set up by the Human Genome Project in digitizing information. And so once you have these vast stores of information available, you can achieve the problem of predicting the folding, the tertiary structure of proteins. But for example, also other colleagues, for example, discovered entirely new classes of antibiotics by basically looking, using an AI at the chemical and biochemical interaction pathways in cells and discovering that there's a whole class of drugs that was never considered as an antibiotic, but that actually have an antibiotic function. And so whenever we have these vast amount of digital data freely available so that researchers can ask these questions easily, we will see these inventions and discoveries and advancements rapidly appearing. And I think one of the most exciting questions is, of course, and I say that with a heavy and a happy heart at the same time, is how can AI be used to transform we do research? Because so far, a lot of AI research is focused on how can we transform our daily lives, how can we help people in healthcare? But the real exciting question comes, how can we build an AI researcher that uses this information to discover new facts about life and the universe?
Thank you very much. Well, my next question is, I was very impressed by the slides where you showed the doctors versus AI, so to speak, competition with the lethal outcomes or lethality for the patients. So obviously, AI can help doctors to analyze situation, accounting for a lot of factors which may elude from the attention or analysis of a doctor sometimes, put them together and to make it more clear, etc. So do you think we can expect the same effect as we saw with the, say, school children who got access to calculators, who stopped being able to make a calculation in mind? Would you think that the doctors would become kind of less of a doctor, become worse doctors than they used to be?
That's a very good question. And of course, in our team, we have fantastic doctors. So Komorowski and Gordon are actually real leaders in the field of intensive care. So I think what happens is that medicine has always been advanced by new technologies becoming available. So when X-ray was invented, the concern was that, oh, doctors don't feel with their fingers anymore where the bone is broken. They're now looking at a picture. I think it transforms medical practice, but it basically gives doctors more of an arsenal in how to make the decisions. In how we envision, for example, our AI clinician is that they're not a standalone doctor treating patients autonomously, but they become a member of a team of doctors where they're human experts, like already exists, that make decisions together about how to best treat a patient. And now they have a very non-intelligent but infinitely smart system supporting them because the system has digested and is able to see a lot of data. So what we've shown for the AI clinician, for example, that the average doctor's decision in intensive care for treating sepsis can be predicted by just looking at 4 or 5 different physiological variables. In contrast, the AI system ingests 20 to 30 different variables that have a higher, that are all used in the decision-making process. And so here we're seeing also, so to speak, limits of the human brain in being able to absorb in short amount of time a lot of numerical data and translate it into decision. And this is where the AI system can help, because it can take a much vaster and richer description of a patient into account and feed a recommendation. And so the doctor can then explore how they want to use these information by trying with themselves in the computer system, what would happen to the patient. So we have a digital twin of the patient in the system that allows to basically doctors to explore what else would happen. And we believe this will simply enrich the human experience. It's really not about replacing doctors, but giving them more and better tools, or sort of smarter or more knowledgeable colleagues. They're not necessarily smarter, but they're definitely more knowledgeable.
Thank you. We obtained a couple more questions from the audience online. What kind of successful experiment projects did you run and implement beneficial to the area of medicine during pandemic COVID-19?
Thank you very much for this question. So we built this intensive care AI clinician before the pandemic, and we were one of the very few AI research labs that are actually focused on intensive care data. So very naturally, we were then called upon. And so I've been a member of the National Emergency Committee to aid critical care decisions. And one of the things that we have set up is the National Service Evaluation in Britain of intensive care units. So we were basically pulling data from hospitals across the country. So we would get a real-time picture of how clinicians and teams were dealing with treating patients. And out of that, we could then basically see how different hospitals operated on these patients and basically feed this back to them. And this was very important because, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, it was not entirely clear what to do and how to do and what worked, what didn't. And very often, even within a hospital, this oversight was lost. And so this was one of the things that we did. Other projects involved, for example, working on using online tools to paint a better picture of symptoms of COVID, because then what we discovered in what is published now is that we're showing basically that patients with different type of preconditions, diabetes or other forms of diseases, actually show very different symptoms from the average symptom that a healthy person will get when they have COVID. And so we think this contributed to asymptomatic transmission because people were basically looking for the wrong symptoms when they belong to some form of group of patients that had preconditions.
Thank you. Next question, can your technologies be implemented in countries that don't have strong medical systems?
That's a very important question. And the question is, what does a strong medical system mean? So when I spoke about this national service evaluation that we did in the UK, many of the hospitals in the UK don't have electronic healthcare records of their patients. And so we developed a system, an online system where patients' data could be entered and we could use that information quickly and efficiently to basically bring it back to the hospital. If we're looking at certain types of diseases, for example, if you want to look at triaging of patients or getting a rough picture or decision recommendation, then a lot of the technologies that we're using can be run off a mobile phone. So if you have a smartphone, Android, iPhone, anything, then you can start using our technologies and recommender systems. So we believe that's actually a very democratic way of looking at that in spreading the best possible care to the maximum amount of people.
Great, thank you. Another question. There is still a gender bias in the field of medicine, especially in identifying symptoms. Can AI help solve it?
A very important question and something very close to my heart. So the challenge for an AI system is, if the data that you feed in is biased in itself, then the AI can even accelerate the bias and make it even worse. So what we need and what we've been advocating is that we think about data sets that need to basically be able to show that they don't have inherent bias in themselves. If there is bias, then we need to apply statistical methods and machine learning methods that can try to remove this bias by basically, just selecting equal portions of how this data is collected and what data is then being used, so that you can remove, for example, gender bias, failure to prescribe, failure to treat appropriately. I'm not sure AI per se will be part of that full answer, but what is interesting is that because for AI we need high quality data, that now people are starting to pay attention to these biases because the data about ethnic and gender and racial and other factors that are differences in the data are being now collected, and people can actually look at and measure the degree of bias in a quantitative way. And so that's where the AI revolution is basically helping understand that, but we need to be very careful not to train our AI systems with biased input data.
Thank you very much. So we are out of time almost. If you allow me one little short question in the end. So I'm sure you remember approach of millennial error problem in 2000, when everybody were very concerned about everything, all computer-driven system to shut down, and the civilization stopping in its tracks. Fortunately, it didn't happen. Now, humankind expecting some problem arising from a rapidly approaching age of AI. So what do you think? Is the problems which would arise would be more like something we expected from the 2000 era problem, or something what apocalyptic movies show us?
Okay, I think this is a very important question. I think the biggest danger of AI is how humans choose to use it. I don't think AI in itself is dangerous. A bit like a gun. It's the human that uses the gun that is dangerous. The gun itself is a tool, and it's about how we're using that tool. And so what we're seeing that around the world, different countries, different trade blocs, Europe, US, China, for example, are basically pursuing slightly different strategies of that. So in Europe, there is very strong legislation regulation that, for example, AI-based decisions that affect human lives need to be rendered explainable on request. So why is the AI doing something? There's also a challenge about how much we value or protect the privacy of individual people. Of course, if you hold all data private, then you don't have data from which you, for example, can train an AI clinician from. So data can save lives. But on the other side, there are, of course, ways of using AI systems that are harmful to people by discriminating against them or facilitating, helping just one group, but not another. So I think it's always ultimately about how we humans, we citizens of the world, choose to use AI systems that will determine what the biggest dangers are of AI.
Thank you so much. This is the end of our session. Thank you, Aldo, for your very entertaining and very interesting story. So I will yield our session to the next speakers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.